Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about my very own book, My Own Pace, A Story of Strength and Adversity on the Camino de Santiago. And I published this book in 2022, and it recounts my 2017 500-mile walk across Spain on the Camino de Santiago. And what made my journey so unique was the added challenge of having neuromuscular disease, Becker muscular dystrophy, and how that affected me on the journey. It made walking up hills, hiking up mountains, walking over steep terrain, difficult terrain, extremely difficult for me. And I fell hundreds of times, had to crawl in certain places, had to have people help me up certain areas. So it was an incredibly difficult journey, and it definitely made for a good book. And this was my first time rereading this book since I published it. And I've skimmed through it a couple times. I've looked for different parts here and there, but it's my first time reading it cover to cover since I published it in 2022. So quite a while. Definitely, I think, enough time to look at it with a very fresh set of eyes and definitely critique it from the most unbiased point of view I can have, being the author of the book. But it holds up very well. I'm fairly satisfied with it, but there are some parts I don't like. There's some bad parts, some good parts. Definitely some parts that made me cringe reading back at the things that I wrote. But I think it's important to, as an author, look back at your work and find things that you don't like. Because if you don't look back and cringe at certain things, I don't think you really grew as a writer. So I think it's a good thing that there were things I didn't like, which I'm going to start by going over the things that I didn't like about this book. I definitely felt like I had a lot of philosophical musings throughout the book where I just kind of reflected on different things that were going on, different thoughts that I had, different conversations I had. But I feel like in a lot of these conversations and things I discuss, I force a lot of conclusions. I definitely, it feels like I'm looking for philosophical things to talk about and just kind of forcing it in certain places. And the Camino de Santiago is a religious pilgrimage for people who are Catholic. And I'm not a religious person, but I had to address religion in this book. It just was such a fundamental theme. Being on the Camino, I came up quite a bit in different conversations I had. And a lot of the reflections I have throughout this book are drawn from different conversation I had with people about religion. So I had to address it. I don't think I covered a lot of the things very well. I definitely feel like I was forcing things, like I said before. And I just tended to go on and on and on when I was discussing these things. I should have just had one sentence where I kind of discussed it all very briefly instead of just going on and on and on. I think that when I wrote this book, I definitely wasn't that good at discussing philosophical things and things that were very deep and meaningful. And to get around that, I kind of just tried to say more when I think saying less would have made a lot of these things I said much stronger. And a lot of the transitions in this book weren't very good. Transitions from paragraph to paragraph, or even within the same paragraph, the way I move from different thoughts, I think, are a little clunky, the way that things are described, which I don't think they're necessarily things that are going to catch other people's eyes when they read it, but just being the writer, I definitely noticed those things. And there's definitely things I would have written differently if I wrote this book again today, which, like I said before, I think that's important. It's important to look back and find things that you don't like. And another thing I noticed in this book, I tend to have the same conversations with people again and again and again. And I think that's also was what really happened, because, people are always asking me, what's wrong with you? Why are you having trouble walking up this hill? Asking me for my story. So I tend to tell people the same story again and again and again. In a couple places, I say in the book, like, I told the person like the same story I told everyone else, just to kind of make it a little more concise and not so boring to the reader. But I definitely, I think you definitely see that I'm having the same conversation again and again and again. And that's really what happened. I did have these kind of conversations with people. I think it's also important to show that, because, a couple parts of the book, I describe how I'm tired of people saying I'm an inspiration. I'm just tired of hearing that again and again and again. So it's definitely important to say that, but I think I definitely could have found a way to say that without it being so boring. I definitely could have found some way to write that a little more concise. But one thing that I didn't like, the opening scene in this book, I don't really have an opening scene. I just kind of start with describing what the journey is. I say, like, from August through October 2017, I walked 500 miles, blah, blah, blah. Just kind of expand from that summary of what happened in one sentence, which it was intentional. I did like the way that was structured, but I think I definitely could have drew the reader in with an opening image. I played around with a couple of different parts in the story that could have worked in the very beginning, but I just didn't find anything that really worked when I was writing it. I just kind of reverted to this. And also, I tried to, in writing, there's an exercise called the first 5 pages. You want to draw the reader in, in the first 5 pages. So I kept chapter 1 as 5 pages. I start by describing what happened in a single sentence and then go through my diagnosis to a lot of things happened in my life that kind of led me to be someone who wanted to hike the Camino, and then get to me heading out on the trail. So in the first 5 pages, the first chapter, I set up the story very, very well. And then getting into chapter 2, I think I do a really good job describing beginning the Camino. When I described that very first night on the Camino, it definitely sets the story very well again, because I described walking up the hill to this office where I checked in the night before I started. And I get off the train, with no plans at nighttime, and I can barely walk up this hill to the office to check in. So I'm just, in the story, I'm describing how I can barely walk up this hill. How am I going to hike 500 miles? I really like that scene. I think that definitely set the stage for the story very well. And I remember that night on the Camino, just being so just anxious and scared and just like, what am I doing here? Why did I decide this would be a good idea? Just thinking about all these places I have to check into, a new hostel every single night, going across the country. I'm just so exhausted on this first day. How is this going to possibly work? There's no way I'll be able to make it. And then right away, when I start in the trail, it talks about me wanting to find someone to walk with. I'm kind of lonely, kind of out of place, and immediately find a group to walk with. And I think that definitely is very reflective of a lot of people's Camino journeys, where they find this group right at the beginning, and they stick with that group throughout the whole journey. And there's this scene where I'm walking to the hamlet of Orison, which is the first stop on the Camino for me, and it's raining, and it's the mountain I'm walking up is just so steep, and I can barely make it, and I'm just like just wanting to get to the hostel, and every building I see, I think it's that, and then it's not, and I'm just completely just drained of energy, just reflecting back on my thoughts the night before, where I'm just wondering, how am I going to be able to do this? And then when I finally get there, it just makes for a really good scene. I think I really did a good job describing that part of the story. And then the dinner at this hostel, or the albergue, as known as on the Camino, the first night, is definitely very good. I think the way I describe it, how I'm meeting different people, talking about the first day. This is very reflective, I think, of someone's first day in the Camino. It was a little more difficult for me having muscular dystrophy, but I definitely, I think, described an average first day on the Camino very well. And I stayed with this group for a couple of days. I think it was 4 or 5 days I was with them. And all throughout my time being with them, I'm constantly wondering when they're going to leave me, when I'm going to be alone, when this group I'm with is going to go ahead of me. So I'm constantly foreshadowing this moment where I separate from them. And it definitely was, in real life, a very emotional moment when I left this group of people, because I'd been with them for the whole time, relying on them. They were helping me different parts on the journey. And just wondering, how am I going to do this on my own the rest of the way? So it was definitely a very difficult moment when that happened. And then immediately after that morning when I separate from this group, I joined this new group of people from Finland. And it kind of feels like it's the answer to me feeling so down about leaving this first group. So it was definitely cool how that happened. I immediately went from one group to another on this journey. And in the second group, I start walking with this girl. I named her Ella in this book. I changed all the names of the people in this book from the real life names, but I'm walking with Ella, and she kind of, for sake of the story, becomes the romantic interest of the story. She was definitely more of a friend, I think, in real life, but in the story, she kind of comes across as this romantic interest in the story, and it kind of comes about in the right place in the story to have that happen. So it definitely, I think, it was good for storytelling, having that happen right there. And she was a very interesting person to talk to and get to know. Definitely one of my favorite people I met on the Camino. And there was one conversation I had with her, I wrote down here, that was interesting, where I talk about how she's a free spirit, because she was a person who was kind of moving around different places throughout her life. She was living in Finland, living in Spain, and about to move back to Finland, and being in Spain now. And I called her a free spirit, and she said a much more of a damaged spirit, because she had some things in her past that she was kind of dealing with. then my response to her was that maybe you have to be a little damaged to be free. And that statement that I said was just really interesting. I reread it this time. I haven't really thought about that since I wrote it, but I think that, being a little damaged to be free, I think it's very reflective of this story. How, I'm someone with muscular dystrophy who has this thing I have to deal with, but I'm out here on this journey being free, just hiking across Spain. So I think that statement is very reflective of the story. I wish I had gone into that a little more, or like reflected a little bit more on that in this book. But yeah, that statement, that little thing I said, definitely stuck out this time that I read it. And then ultimately I leave that group. The next day I leave them. In the book, I was really excited to be with this new group, but some of the people in the group didn't want to be with me. They wanted to kind of just be together. It was a mother and daughter, and they wanted to kind of do their own thing as a family, which is understandable. But I was definitely very sad when that happened. Because I thought that everything was going to work out. I had this new group that I would be with for a couple of days, and then they left me. But I think that sets very well this part of the book where I'm on my own finally. I'm not with this group. I'm just kind of on my own journey. And it's one guy that I'm walking with. I forget his name in the book. I think I changed his name to Tom. He says, well, I was telling him how sad I was to be alone, not walking with a group. He said that there's no, well, I said that I feel like the slowest person on the Camino or something. And he said there's no such thing as slow in the Camino. There's only your own pace. And that kind of became the title. My Own Pace came from these things that Tom said. So that definitely, I think, came at the right point in the story where finally on my own, reflecting on being my own, and I kind of have this idea of my own pace, which becomes the core theme of this book. Another part in this book that I really liked, I was walking with this American guy. He's a guy from Arizona. We were walking, we walked past this old, crumbling old cathedral, and he talked about how cathedrals represent the idea of faith in a non-religious idea, because these cathedrals take sometimes thousands of years to build. So when someone starts this cathedral, they're not going to live to see this cathedral be finished. So there has to be some kind of faith that people have to build a cathedral, knowing they're not going to see it through to the end. And he talks about how it's a good example of faith, a non-religious example of faith that you can find on the Camino. And I wish I had referenced that a little more in this book, because obviously I'm not a religious person. I'm trying to find connections between these religious ideas, in my own life. So I think that would have been it was a good thing that I used to kind of draw connections. But I wish I had gone into that a little more. That would have been a good place I could have talked a little more about religion and different philosophical ideas. But I would say the most exciting part of this book is when I get sick and get bed bugs. There's a stretch on this journey where I get food poisoning at this restaurant that I ate at, and at the same time I'm covered in bed bug bites. And it was just a miserable part of this journey where I just wanted to give up. I just wanted this to be over. I didn't know how it was going to end. And in the moment, it was, I think, the lowest point of my journey, but it made for the most exciting reading in this book. But also, I feel like when I got sick and got bed bugs, the way I describe it, it just kind of fizzles out. I mean, that's what happened. I was sick, I was throwing up, having diarrhea, and it got less and less over time. The bed bugs kind of just slowly, petered out. I was getting less and less bites. But I wish I had put a little more of conclusion to that part of the story, a little more conclusion of getting through this, being sick and having bed bugs. But it just kind of petered out, as the journey went on. But that's what really happened. So I don't know if I should have had some conclusion to that portion of the story, or it's better the way I had it. But I would say that the climax of this story is this place called Cruz de Ferro. Cruz de Ferro is this place where you take a rock from your home and you leave it behind on this pile of rocks. It represents leaving behind a burden that you carried with you onto the trail that you're letting go of. And the placement of that in the journey is a very odd place, because the way I describe the Cruz de Ferro, it kind of is, the climax of all of these things I'm reflecting on throughout the journey. But it's not at the end of the Camino. It's about 3/4 of the way through. So it was kind of oddly placed to have this moment where I'm having all these deep reflections about life and my struggles, and just kind of a culmination of all these things that I've talked about throughout the journey, kind of culminating here. And Cruz de Ferro was the clear point to have to talk about those kind of things. But I wish that that was at the end of the story. If that was at the end, it would have made the story flow so much better. It wasn't something I could really move around. I wasn't really given, the choice to move around where things are on the trail, where specific milestones are on the trail. I mean, different conversations I had with people, different people I met, like I can move that around a little bit for storytelling purposes, but the location of something on the trail can't be changed. So I was kind of forced to have that there. And I think because of that, the story just got kind of repetitive at the end because I kind of was weaving in all these different reflections and philosophical musings into this point at Cruz de Ferro. And after that, it was kind of hard to reflect on those things again because I had already finished talking about all that stuff. So it got a little repetitive at the end. It was just kind of the same thing over and over and over, the same conversations over and over and over. And also, this book has way too many endings because obviously there's that climax at Cruz de Ferro where that kind of is an ending from some certain point of view, but reaching Santiago is an ending. And also I feel like there's also an ending where I meet up with Ella again and I say goodbye to her, and that also acts as an ending. But what makes it even more difficult is I went back to the Camino in 2018 and did the Portuguese Camino, a whole different route that connected to Santiago and then went on to the coast. So I included that in here as well. So that journey has a conclusion when I reach Finisterre at the very end. So it just goes on and on. And then, to make it even worse, after I get to Finisterre and finish that journey, I go to Wyoming when I get back to the US. And Wyoming comes into the story, my experience in Wyoming. I spent a lot of time there throughout my life. But the rock I leave behind at Cruz de Ferro was a rock from Wyoming, because I did a lot of hiking there and just spent a lot of time in my early 20s there. That's really where I think the first place I really pushed myself physically. So it was important for me to leave rock from there behind. So I talk about Wyoming there, and then at the very end, when I go back to Wyoming, I bring it up again, where I'm standing on top of this ridge here where I can see the mountain that I climbed back in 2013, where I got my rock from. So I'm kind of bringing the story full circle. And the moment that I was there was actually a year to the day that I started the Camino in 2017. So it was very fitting to be there at that time, be there at the place where I got the rock from. But to someone reading this book who doesn't know me, I definitely feel like that felt out of place. It just kind of came out of nowhere. I was just in Wyoming all of a sudden. But what I think that was getting at for me personally, the Camino was part of a much larger journey in my life. There was this era in my 20s where I did a lot of traveling, and Camino was just part of that. And there's much more going on in my life that was all kind of being woven together and different things I was doing. But I think in other books I do and other videos I do on this YouTube channel, I would talk more about other travels I did and how it all kind of fits into one story. But in my own pace, I tried to pull some of that into this, which I think it just kind of felt out of place. I don't know if other people feel the same way. I'm curious what other people think about how I did that. But as for this being my first time reading this book since 2022, I definitely feel like it held up fairly well. Definitely pretty satisfied with how it still reads. I mean, there are obviously, like I said, parts that could have been better, but I think that ultimately it's a good story. The story is probably better than the writing in this book, but it's definitely the best that I could do at the time. I had pretty much no writing experience for writing this book, so I think given that, it was really the best I could do. I'm pretty satisfied with what the final product was. Definitely could have done better, wrote this again today, but that's part of the writing process. It's important to, I think, write something and then look back years later and see how much you've grown. But it was also, I think, at the point where I did so many drafts, probably a dozen or so drafts of this book, trying to get it right. It was at the point where it's like, do I really want to write this again? Like, I have this book, it's in a pretty decent form. I kind of just want to get off my chest and get it published and kind of move on to other projects. So that was kind of, I think, part of it as well. But it's definitely reflective, like I said, of the time that I wrote this. Didn't have much experience writing, and this is what I got. So given that, I'm fairly satisfied with it. Tended to get pretty good reviews on Amazon. All the comments that people had on it seemed to be pretty positive. I'm curious what other people think who have read this book, what your thoughts are on it, if you thought it was good, things you didn't like. I'm definitely open to negative criticism. I enjoy negative criticism. It definitely makes me grow as a writer and as a person. So don't hold back any negative thoughts you have on this book. I'm definitely open to whatever people have to say. But yeah, that's my own pace, the story of strength and adversity in the Camino de Santiago. And I'm going to do another video soon talking about this story, not through the lens of the book, just telling the story as it happened. and also getting into the process of writing this book. The process of writing My Own Pace was probably just as important to me as the actual journey that this story's about. The writing process definitely makes you reflect a lot on yourself. I definitely grew a lot through writing this book. But anyway, be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.